Ghost with Cats, Chapter 13, The One She Was Looking For. Author's Note: This chapter contains trigger warnings for violence against women, kidnapping, and murder. If such things are disturbing to you, please skip to the next chapter. Thank you. When Annie walked into the kitchen, they looked at her. Her hair was still wet, her eyes were red. She knew she must look a disheveled mess. All she wanted to do was go back upstairs and crawl into bed, but she had promised Tall she would tell him the story of her nightmare. She heard them speaking in a strange language of their world. It sounded remarkably close to ancient Aramaic. She thought she heard the words for survival, suffering, strength, rage, and understanding. Tall spoke in her language. Breeze wishes to say something to you. Breeze cannot hear about those who hurt his Lady Annie. Breeze's rage is too much. Breeze asked Lady Annie to forgive Breeze's weakness. Breeze looked down at the floor as if ashamed of himself. Annie put her hand on his cheek. Breeze, y'all are not weak. It was a terrible thing, and you have a soft heart. Just know that everyone who hurt me is dead. I killed them, just like I killed the man I found beating you with a pipe. If you don't want to know, I understand, Annie said quietly. He nodded. Breeze make firewood for Lady Annie. She hugged his thick neck. Thank you, gentle giant little brother. Breeze half smiled and went outside, followed by a large yellow and white cat that belonged to Herlinda and Jorge. She could hear the thunk of the axe in the wood begin. Annie was glad Breeze didn't want to hear. He was such a gentle soul. Her wounds should not be shared with someone like him. Annie poured a cup of coffee, put sugar in it, and went into the living room. She stoked the fire and watched it burn for a few minutes before she sat down. She felt very cold, in her body, in her soul, but she made herself do it anyway. Bourne and Tall sat quietly, waiting for her to begin. All she had to do was say the first words, and the rest would pour out. Her mantra of rules chanted. Rule for daily life number 2. Do not dwell on your past or your pain. You did not die that week. Annie was about to break this rule. She broke it every time she told the story, every time she relived her nightmare. It always seemed so much harder to breathe before she started. The air seemed so much colder in the room, like her unheated cell. A cloud obscured the sun outside. Even the light drew itself away from the darkness she endured, leaving her defenseless against the onslaught of remembered pain to come. Her therapist said she needed to talk about it. It would help. They also said someday she would stop having nightmares. Someday she would stop feeling cold. Annie thought they were all liars. "7 years ago today, yesterday, I brought my fiancé home for the holidays to meet my parents. We always came here for Christmas and sometimes in the summer. I was working with the Mossad and Saudi and Yemeni intel, MI6, and our NSA CIA joint project, looking for non-traditional weapons of mass destruction to be used against the oil fields that supply most of our world's fuel resources. I met Sheikh Opir Amir's grandson Hadif, who was also on the joint task force as an energy engineer. He was a brilliant and charming Arabian prince, and I was a foolish girl from Texas. She stopped to sip her coffee. Forgive me, Lady Annie. You hardly seem like the foolish type, regardless of your age, Vaughan observed. She sighed. I was almost 22 and had never been in a relationship with a man. I never even had a real boyfriend. I was the definition of foolish. I saved myself for my husband and my marriage night as I was taught by my faith. I'm actually very shy, but I compensate. We spent the Hajj with Hadif's family, whom I adored. It was wonderful. Then 2 months later, we came here to spend Christmas with mine. My father was retired Air Force, and Mama was a physicist. They were working together on the third incarnation of Pandora. Mom and I spent the whole morning decorating and baking. She was telling me how there was an issue with it getting out of control, even on the smallest scale. Dad and Hadif went for a walk around the lake to go ice fishing while I looked at Mom's numbers. Tucking her legs underneath her, she seemed to shrink. It was just after lunch. I was sitting on the bed in the room where you two were sleeping, petting the neighbor's cat when I figured out part of the energy resonance issue, despite the use of a counter-resonance dampening frequency. It was the static in Duffy's fur that sparked the solution. I realized the energy was becoming self-amplifying, and that was why they lost control. The more the ions vibrated, the more they wanted to vibrate. So I proposed adding a second counter-resonance. When I ran the first numbers, it showed an increase in power along with a more stable reaction. Daddy was so proud, and Mama laughed about me and cats. Hadif just smiled and brought me a cup of tea, telling me he had chosen wisely, a bride who was brilliant and beautiful. I never felt so happy. Looking at her cup, it seemed to make her sadder. I didn't drink coffee then, only tea like Mom. The tea was one of the many floral teas from a box he gave me. He said he bought me the huge sampler of teas from his native land, so he would always know my favorite. I hadn't even opened it yet. The tea was sweet and pungent, exotic tasting, so different from my usual Earl Grey. I started feeling strange and fell asleep. I'd only written half the equations down. I woke to my mother screaming. I couldn't stand, so I crawled into the living room. My parents were both dead. Mama was right there. She pointed at the spot in front of the fireplace, then to the place in front of the windows. And Daddy was there. If I close my eyes, I can still see their blood and bodies. The doctors call it post-traumatic stress. They don't know I come back here. No one knows except my best friend. She's the only one who knows I still own this cabin. But I could never sell it. It would be like selling their bodies. Tears poured down her cheeks. She was quiet for a few moments. Outside, there was the steady thunk of Brice's axe. She really didn't want to continue, but she'd barely begun, and she couldn't stop. Once she started, she had to tell. all that happened during those days in one go, or her anxiety attacks and nightmares would trap her the way her fiancé once trapped her in his lies. What I didn't know was the terrorist I was looking for was the one I was engaged to. Rule for survival number 1. Always have your tools. Hadif had been using his job on the task force to hide his group's attempts to buy a bomb. But after he met me and learned about Pandora, they decided to use it to get what they wanted. He treated me like a princess, with gifts and fine manners and romance. Everything a girl dreams about. It was too perfect, like something out of a movie or a romance novel. I fell in love with him, but he was in love with the destructive power of my parents' research and how much money he could make. He drugged me, killed them, then took all of my parents' paperwork on the Pandora device and my notes. He must have driven me down the mountain, because all I remember is someone carrying me onto a small jet that took me away. I woke up the next day. My watch said it was December 22nd. I was on a dirty bed in a brick room. A man in a hood brought me a meal. He held out my notebook and a pencil. She breathed out slowly. Her thumb rubbed her writer's callus because she didn't have a pen. Then she revealed. They couldn't make Pandora work. When I refused to write out the rest of the formulas, Hadif was shoved in the room like he was a prisoner too. He begged me to finish the device so they would let us go. He got angry when I said I wouldn't. She sobbed slightly. He asked me if I loved him and claimed they were going to kill us. If I loved him, I would tell them what they wanted. When I reached up to touch his bruises, they wiped off. I backed against the wall when he demanded to know what was wrong. I just held up my fingertips. He swore. Then he started laughing, telling me how stupid I was, how easy it was to gain my trust. He told me to finish the bomb, or he wouldn't love me anymore. I slapped him as hard as I could. He looked so surprised. Then he slapped me. So I punched him and broke his nose. Hadif began beating me, hitting me like I'd never been hit before. And when I couldn't fight back anymore, he... She stopped again because she didn't want to cry. Just took several deep breaths as tears leaked from her eyes. Well, it wasn't the romantic wedding night I'd always hoped for. Afterward, I still wouldn't give him the rest of the figures. I refused to help them with everything I was. His buddies began to threaten him, so he gave me to them. They all took their turns with me and laughed about it while I was chained with a bag over my head. It was humiliating and horrible. The next day, they tried to give me truth serum and a bunch of other drugs. There was more abuse, and every time I passed out, they would throw ice water on me to revive me, or hold me down in a tub of ice water. Her fist clenched tightly around her coffee mug. She was so afraid it would break in her hands. They weren't even making the bomb for religious or political reasons. They just wanted money and to cause fear. I heard them talking about the things they could buy. It made me so angry and more determined to resist. Every day they tortured me and every night they raped me. Christmas Eve, they held me under too long and I almost drowned. I was barely conscious, so when they dosed me again, my heart slowed and almost stopped. They thought I was dead, so they threw me in the trash pile. I was just a toy to them. Something to fill their sadistic whims and time while Hadith finished an unstable version of the bomb. I didn't know that many people were looking for me in Hadith. The cats had gone home covered in my parents' blood, and the neighbors called the police, who called the government, who called the task force. Her coffee was almost gone. She couldn't stop shaking. She felt so cold. She pulled the Afghan from the couch around her closer, staring at the lights on the tree, trying to see them and not her memories. They thought Hadif and I had been kidnapped. They'd gotten a ransom message for the device with images of my torture and fake images of him being tortured. Hadif's grandfather, Shiko Pir, promised to pay anything to get us back. One of his Bedouin spies found the place where they were hiding. He found me in the trash, barely alive. He hid me in a building, got me warm again, and went for help. Being raised as I was, a Texas military brat, I got up and I decided I was going to kill them all. I learned to hunt when I was 5 years old. They were animals, so I hunted them. I stabbed them, cut their throats one by one. I piled their bodies up, then I burned their compound to the ground. It was the only time since I was 14 that the smell and sight of blood didn't make me want to vomit. Rule number 4 for survival. You are the only one who will save yourself. Never quit trying. This was where she was usually interrupted with the question every person she had ever told the story to, who wasn't there, asked. What do you mean you hunted them? Did you really stab them all? Or her least favorite from her many therapists, why did you feel the need to kill them like that? It was like people thought it was okay for all 7 of them to repeatedly rape her. Forgivable that they wanted to commit an act of terrorism that would have harmed the whole world for money, but wrong of her to kill them violently as they deserved. Annie waited, turning her face and staring at the flickering of the fire. She felt cold again, but it had nothing to do with the temperature of the room and everything to do with the temperature of her memories. She didn't understand why neither Tal nor Vorn said anything as her mind replayed those moments.